Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome. This is the Love, Hope and Unity program. And we're just recovering from the big cultural festival yesterday. It was very good, Daniel.
Oh,
And
good to hear.
thank you to everybody who organised it. And our guest this morning is Daniel Trilling, all the way from London. I think it's London anyway, isn't it? So thank you so much for coming on at very short notice. And we did have some hassles this morning, but we've got there now. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And Daniel's written a book, and it's called, I don't know whether we can see it. It's called If We Tolerate This, How the British Establishment made the far right respectable. And by the far right, we're talking about Nigel Farage and Reform and the racists, even worse than him behind that. The ones that come into our market square in Nottingham with their big signs saying, and you probably have seen this, Daniel, saying mass deportations now. And another sign they have is refugees are raping here. Now, by that, they mean Muslim men, particularly newly arrived immigrants, and particularly people who come in to England across the channel on the small boats, because they scapegoats those people. I don't need to tell you, this audience, that that's not true, because this is a largely, Daniel, a South Asian audience. Okay, so how did it happen? I was just saying before you got on that these things were completely unacceptable even 2 or 3 years ago. And there's been a huge change in what people are finding acceptable to campaign on. In fact, Nigel Farage himself has said on TV that he will set up mass deportation centres in every town. And you're nodding here, Daniel, aren't you? So, first of all, thank you for your book. I've read it very carefully, and I'm old enough to remember most of it, which is great to read about the things you've lived through. I've been a campaigner all my life, particularly on anti-racism. So I remember a lot of this stuff. So a few questions. And are you okay, Daniel, to stay until 12?
Yeah, that's fine.
You're okay. Thank you very much, because I know your time is precious. Okay, so key questions. How did we get here? We'll do them one at a time, but I'll give you them all at the beginning. How did we get here? What can we do about it? And in particular, what are the hopeful things in a time of difficulty like now? So feel free to interrupt me, Daniel. I'll feel free to interrupt you. We're both experienced campaigners and talkers, and we've met before, haven't we? So how did we get to this appalling situation?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the first really important question. And I think you're right to point out that there's been this very rapid change over the last couple of years where it has become acceptable for politicians right in the mainstream to say things and to advocate for policies that within very recent memory were regarded as extreme and were confined to very marginal groups, that had no presence in our mainstream media or mainstream politics. And something that I tried to do with the new book, If We Tolerate This, is to explain what's been building long term that's enabled this to happen, and then what's changed just in the last few years to enable this kind of much more rapid shift. And I think maybe I'll start with the kind of widest angle view. Obviously, Britain is experiencing a local version of what lots of different bits of the world are going through at the moment, which is that, internationally, we have seen the rise of a new kind of far-right politics, which has become very successful in many countries, and in some countries is, has now taken power.
Including, particularly for this audience, with Narendra Modi in India.
Yeah, Modi in India, Trump in the US. We've seen leaders come and go in the last few years, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, whose son is now intending to run for president to win back power from the left. So, those examples tell you, first of all, this is a global phenomenon. It's happening actually across a range of different cultures and regions across the world. And I think the big background factors to why that's happening is that there's been a breakdown in the traditional political consensus since the global financial crisis of 2008. Populations around the world have been very discontented with the economy, with politics as they knew it, and so on. And one of the currents, among others, that has profited from this is this new far right, who, as well as echoing far right movements of the past, so they trade very heavily in radical right wing nationalism. They uniformly attack key institutions of liberal democracy, like independent courts, free press. Sometimes they try to undermine elections, as Donald Trump is doing yet again in the US at the moment, ahead of the midterms there. And they trade in scapegoating of minority groups, of anyone that they can kind of, within their own cultural context, anyone they think will be useful to shift blame onto, and to tell people, we're going to make you feel like your lives are getting better by punishing these other groups on your behalf. So that's kind of common to far right politics wherever you found it throughout history. What's new about what's happening now is that the kind of leading crop of politicians and activists around the world are using a particular style of politics, which is usually referred to as populism. So far right populism works inside electoral systems, so unlike, say, the Nazis of Germany in the 1920s and 30s, I mean, obviously they did stand for election initially, but they also, were a paramilitary organization as much as a traditional political party. Far right populism stays away for the most part from that overt violence. What it tells people is this is all kind of normal and fits within our understanding of democracy and so on. But once those far right populists get their hands on power, things take a very different turn. And even when they haven't got their hands on power, in a situation like the UK, their presence on the scene can send things, as you were just saying, in a rapidly much more extreme direction. So that's kind of what we're living with at the moment internationally. And then in Britain, the way that this is played out, at least how I try to argue it in my book, is to say, right, you can't understand why this has happened without, first of all, going back to the financial crisis of 2008. And then in particular, the austerity policies that the government of David Cameron and Nick Clegg rolled out across.
And I'll just interrupt a minute there. And those austerity policies were a choice. They told us it has to be, and there's no other way, and we're all sacrificing together. It was nonsense, because I didn't see any of the elites sacrificing.
Yeah.
Farage was busy with all his money, but it was a choice, and it has been pointed out that it was a choice by international agencies. There were other possibilities rather than trying to take money away from the poorest.
Yeah, I mean, international agencies, many observers in the UK. I remember at one point the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, as he then was, even intervened and said, we're making choices to inflict hardship and poverty on people, and that they're avoidable choices. And in fact, actually, that claim that there is no alternative, I think, has got a lot to do with what we've then seen since politically, because what was happening, for listeners who don't remember that time as well, maybe because they were too young, or it is, to be fair, quite a long time ago, the 2008 financial crash was not supposed to happen, because prior to that we were living under this economic system and this way of doing politics called neoliberalism, which was something Margaret Thatcher introduced to the UK. And part of its offer to people was, well, look, we're going to remove all of these messy political decisions from your direct control. We're no longer going to have these battles between left and right, in and out of parliament, and so on. Let's all agree that economics is best governed by market forces. And Thatcher introduced that with a fair amount of violence. You know, the miners' strike and the crushing of trade union power was part of introducing that system. But once that was all done, that was kind of the trade-off with the general population. You know, let us handle this, or rather let our friends in the City of London handle this, and you'll just have rising living standards indefinitely.
Yeah, and they called it trickle down, didn't they? It was nonsense. I've not seen much trickling down. I bet most of our listeners haven't.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
it's really important, that
Yeah,
notion that it was absolutely a choice.
you know, so that was a choice, but it was presented as there is no alternative. That was Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, but also Labour bought into it. So Gordon Brown, when he was Tony Blair's Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave a famous speech saying, no more boom and bust. You know, we're not going to have these financial crises like we had in the past anymore. And that all collapsed in 2008, you know, not just economically, but the kind of the rationale for that system, that there was no alternative. This is the only way to run things. But what you had as a response from the traditional political elites was that they just tried to kind of shore up the system and keep telling people there was no alternative. So when Cameron and Clegg introduced austerity, that was exactly what they said. You know, we have to do this. Or
We're
you know,
all in it together.
I was
We're
just about to say,
nonsense. Yeah.
you know, they tried to soften the blow a bit by saying, well, you know, everybody's sacrificing. It wasn't true. And what you get when a whole political class is telling people there's no alternative to our decisions, unpleasant as you may find them, is that people get quite angry about that, understandably. And in the 2010s, you had a lot of anger expressed on the left. You know, there were those big student occupations of universities in 2010 and 2011. You had the largest, at that point, ever trade union demonstration in the centre of London, demonstrating against austerity. But you also had a lot of discontent that was pulling to the right as well. And the right always has an advantage in these situations because much of the media is owned by billionaires and business interests who see an interest in promoting right-wing politics, partly to keep out of, partly to make sure the left doesn't get a foothold, and partly because it just reflects their own worldview. If you look at someone like Elon Musk, for instance,
Who are financing enormous money, billions of money being funneled directly and unashamedly to these far-right organizations.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look back to the 2010s now, then seems like kind of small fry compared to the amount of money that's sloshing around now in that area of politics. But my argument in the book is you have to understand that that's where it was all building from. Then you had the Brexit referendum in 2016, which was partly off the back of lots of people in Britain feeling like the country was going the wrong way and there needed to be something to change that. And for a chunk of the population, leaving the EU was the answer. But you know, regardless of what your views on leave or remain were at the time, I think we can all agree now that the immediate effect of that referendum was to polarize British politics and to actually kind of embolden the far right to a greater degree than it had been before, because, you know, fundamentally Brexit was a question about nationalism and national identity and the direction of the country, and those are themes that the far right plays on. You know, that's what it's there to do, is to kind of agitate around those questions and send them in a very damaging and extreme direction. And so that's the kind of long background. You had increasing chaos in the centre of British politics, you know, successive governments trying to deal with all the mess that I've just described, telling people they would solve it. You know, Theresa May said she would solve it. Boris Johnson said he would solve it. Keir Starmer said he would solve it.
Liz Truss as well, of course.
Very
our
brief.
shortest lived prime minister, who did untold damage to the economy. No accountability there.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, as the Daily Star showed us at the time, didn't outlast a lettuce. And so you've had this, you know, Britain has gone in quite a short space of time from being a country with a very stable national political system. You know, we in this country, we've been used for generations to power going backwards and forwards between two major parties. And now we've got a situation where, what is it? If you've got a 14-year-old child, Andy Burnham will be their 7th prime minister in their lifetime, you know, compared to, say, the first, when I was 14, we'd had 2 prime ministers. Margaret Thatcher and John Major, for instance.
Yeah, and in fact, the Tory party had been in power since, what was it, 1886 or something?
Yeah, the majority
Is only like 36 years or something like that. I'm quoting your book without being accurate. In that whole period. And now it looks like the Tory party is finished, and possibly the Labour Party too. Unprecedented.
Exactly. So we're now in a situation where, depending on which bit of the UK you live in, we've got 4 or even 5 party politics with 4 or 5 parties all competing for roughly similar shares of the vote at the moment. And so you've got that kind of long-term decay of Westminster politics, and the rise of various forms of kind of angry, radical, right-wing nationalist responses to all of this. We need to leave the EU. We need to look after our own. Too many things in our society are going to people who don't deserve them, and so on. Those are the kind of constant themes that you'll hear coming from the right. And then on top of that, you've got the far right itself, which over the same period has evolved and adapted to the world as it is today. So for a long time in Britain, far right meant neo-Nazis, people who admired Adolf Hitler or Mussolini from, Italian fascism in the 1920s and 30s, and were essentially trying to recreate versions of those movements on Britain's streets. That really ended with the BNP, the British National Party. Or actually, that's not quite right. It hasn't ended. There are still groups and people who believe in those ideas and are looking for ways to revive them now in 2026. But those groups are relatively marginal. They involve small numbers of people. They can be very damaging. They can be very threatening to people that they target, but they are absolutely nowhere near any kind of foothold within the formal political system. What you've had instead is the rise of these right-wing populist parties that I was talking about earlier, and they've succeeded, particularly in Britain, because they've made a big thing about distancing themselves from the traditional far right. So Nigel Farage, Britain's most successful right-wing populist leader ever, he's always made this big thing about how former members of the BNP aren't allowed to join his party, when it was UKIP first of all, and now Reform UK. At the same time, what successful right-wing populists do is work out where that line between respectability and radicalism lies on the right, and push it right up to the edge as much as they can, and look for ways to kind of push things further, to widen the boundaries of what's considered acceptable. So Farage has been very skillful in doing this for many years. I think a good example of how he's traditionally behaved was his response to the murders in Southport in 2024.
Absolutely appalling lies.
But this is the interesting thing about Farage. So you had lots of lies being told, mainly online.
Let's just remind our listeners, this is when 3 girls were murdered, and 1 or 2 adults and many others attacked. Can you just remind our listeners what happened?
So it was a young man entered a child's dance class in Southport in Merseyside, and he attacked the girls and their teacher and killed 3 of the girls and injured several others. So a horrific crime, very understandably shocking. Everybody who heard about it was shocked and angry and wanted to know why it had happened. But for a collection of different extremist and far right activists on the internet and other people who just wanted to make money out of spreading disinformation, it was an opportunity to tell lies that would further their cause. And so there were lots of false claims made in the 24 hours or so after the murders about the identity of the perpetrator. So you had claims that he was an asylum seeker who had arrived on a small boat across the channel, claims that he was of Muslim background, and so on. And these things weren't true. I mean, even if they were true, it wouldn't, what happened next was not justified. But what that did was it whipped up all of this anger at a very sensitive moment. and people attacked mosques, they attacked hotels housing asylum seekers, they tried to burn those buildings in some cases. There was violence, outbursts of violence around England and in Northern Ireland, targeting people who weren't white and so on. And that kind of tells you about what's changed with the far right. One is that there is now this huge space online where ideas and claims like that can circulate and reach far more people than they could have even 15 years ago. You know, when I started writing about the far right, so I've been writing about the far right since the late 2000s. I started off writing about the BNP when they were still around as a political force. And in those days, even with the internet then, to find those kind of extreme ideas, you had to go looking very hard for them. You know, you had to go on to particular internet forums, or you had to go to the British Library and go to the kind of restricted materials collection and get them to agree to show you all of the...
Now it's all over, free access to the internet and
exactly
GBC news channels, and everyone gets fed everything that they to confirm their own prejudices.
Exactly. And so you've got this new media environment that unfortunately is a huge benefit to far right extremists, anybody who wants to inflame a situation like that of the summer 2024 after the murders. But the cleverer politicians who start fishing in those waters know how to play the game a bit more subtly, and I think that is exactly what someone like Nigel Farage is very good at. So during that period where there were these very clearly false claims being made about the identity of the Southport murderer, all Farage said at that point was, why aren't they telling us the full truth? I think the police know something they're not telling us. So he just left it hanging in the air like that.
A question mark and
exactly.
Kind of almost a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, but not quite. So you can never quite accuse him of doing anything wrong, but he just insinuates enough that he benefits from all of that other stuff that's being stirred up, but also it allows him to pose as, well, I'm much more moderate than these things around me. And so that's kind of what brought us to where we are now. But actually the more that these ideas enter the mainstream, the more extreme things become as well. And I think the combination, particularly of the collapse of the Conservative Party, for the reasons I was describing, alongside the growth and spread of far-right ideas online, but also actually in our communities as well around the UK, means that there's then been this very rapid kind of deterioration of mainstream political debate, obviously around immigration and asylum most of all. But if you look at other countries elsewhere in the world, you can see that essentially it could be any issue that's got that potential to be controversial. So we mentioned India before. Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalists, the BJP, have profited from a similar combination of factors politically, discontent with India's traditional political class, skillful use of social media to build up a base outside those traditional circles and so on, knowing how to inflame a situation when it's convenient to do so. But for the most part, Modi's platform is not really about immigration. It's about targeting and stigmatizing Muslim Indian citizens and kind of recasting the idea of what the Indian nation is about. In Brazil, when Bolsonaro was president, again, immigration was not the key issue there. It was all about suppressing and persecuting the left, and pushing this very reactionary form of gender politics, real kind of macho, anti-feminist, anti-LGBT politics. But the kind of methods and the underlying conditions are the same, I think, in all those cases. And so in Britain, we're seeing our version of it. And I think what makes it particularly alarming here is that even though politically the far right is not that strong even now, reform in the local elections in May attracted around 26 or 27% of the vote overall in England.
I'm interested in you saying that, because they did win lots of county councils and thousands, was it 1,500 local council councillors became reform councillors, but you see them as not very strong.
I mean, I'm not downplaying the significance of those victories. You know, in a very short space of time, they've become a significant force within national UK politics. Because of the fragmentation of everything else, it gives them a chance of potentially winning an election, a general election, and forming a government or being part of a government in a few years' time. But they're nowhere near commanding a majority of the population's support. And in fact, those elections in May, although it was an advance for them in terms of numbers of seats and councils, it actually indicated they may well have hit a ceiling in their level of support, because those May elections were supposed to be the moment that Reform made its big breakthrough. And this is what they were briefing the press in the months leading up to it. You know, that was supposed to be Reform's big breakthrough into traditional, more moderate, more affluent Tory voting areas, particularly in the southeast of England. You know, they were tipped to win control of several London councils, and
they didn't.
They didn't. No.
Yeah, very interesting.
But
expanding his base from the places like round here in Nottinghamshire, a lot of North Nottinghamshire, it was coal and the pits were closed, and lots of other local industry, like we had a big rally depot here making bicycles, and all that's gone. And so we're left with relatively insecure, non-industrial industries. And I think that's one of the things I appreciated about your book and about your talk last week, was understanding how the far right or Farage appeals to white people, giving them a sense of meaning, purpose, identity, even being better than other people. Having been the bottom dog, now they can be the top dog. You know, big shades of white supremacy views there, that white people are in fact better in every way than black and brown people. And that's like, and offering them community and hope and a way forward. And all those psychological things are very important. But we have to, and we'll move to looking at future and the hope in a minute, because that's very important. We have to be offering those things: identity, hope, a way forward, a sense of belonging, a sense of purposefulness rather than despair. But obviously, not the way that the far right with their massive scapegoating is doing. So, would it be possible, because you've only got 12 minutes left, Daniel, to start talking about hope and the future, and particularly what we, and I say we because as a white person, and also the black and brown communities can be doing? Because I know, because I was there, we did defeat the British National Party in the 70s, 80s with Rock Against Racism, the Anti-Nazi League. I heard you say they're a slightly different kettle of fish. And we need to be thinking about what we can be doing now, because in Nottingham we are building solidarity movements. So is it okay to switch you into that, please, Daniel? The future and hope, and maybe Binface and Farage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good point to switch, because as I was saying, you know, the situation we're in now, it is really alarming and a very dangerous time. But at the same time, it's important not to overhype what is going on the right, and to see that it is also full of weaknesses and contradictions. You know, Reform are not doing as well as they would probably like to be by this point. And one of the big reasons why is because it comes exactly down to what you were just describing, you know, so why people in Nottinghamshire, for instance, might be voting for Reform or just sympathetic to what they have to say. And the contradiction between that and the other things that Reform stands for and represents. Because what it's trying to do is say two different things at the same time, really. It's taking that very widespread feeling, particularly in working class former industrial areas of England, that things took a wrong turn at some point in the recent past, that the things that used to make life feel stable and secure and make you feel like you had hope in the future or hope for your families, children, and so on, have either gone completely or they've decayed. So like the shift from relatively stable jobs to gig economy work, is a huge thing. So I know, I don't claim to be an expert in every bit of the country, but I did actually grow up in Derbyshire, so not too far away. Around this, it's not even a news story really, but Shirebrook in Derbyshire, which used to be one of the colliery sites, is now near to a huge sports retailer warehouse where people work on kind of 0-hour contracts and for low pay and so on. That sort of thing has happened all around the UK. Some people feel it directly as a kind of to do with their jobs, but I think the much more widespread thing, and this is what the far right really taps into, is a more general sense about just the nature of your community. Like, it's kind of, things are coming apart, decisions aren't being made in your interest, they're being made over your heads by people who don't understand what it's like where you live. And for a certain number of people, you see either as a cause of that or a symptom of it, changes in the demographics. This area used to be entirely white and now it's multi-ethnic, or this area never used to be used to house asylum seekers and now it is. And the far right have kind of bundled that up all together, and they're kind of implying to people that vote for what we say, which is essentially to be cruel to other people and to punish them, and it will make all of that go away.
Let's just underline that, because we talk about policies and kind of abstract stuff as well, but when you say it, to be cruel to other people and punish them, and that includes a lot of poor people, disabled people who legitimately are sick and claiming, quite rightly, benefits, I think it brings a human element in it. Their policies are about legitimizing and encouraging being cruel to other people, particularly the most vulnerable, and punishing people who are not part of the problem.
Yeah, and just to move it on quickly, because I know we've not got that much time left, what I was going to say is that that's what the far right is offering people. That's what Reform UK offers people. At the same time, what it stands for is the right for people like Nigel Farage and his crypto billionaire friends and all of the millionaires who are now Reform Party spokespeople or MPs to carry on making the money in the way they did during the peak years of neoliberalism. And those two things do not go together, because the latter is what gave us the former. That's what destroyed communities. And so the way, I think, to respond to this, and this is what the traditional political class, Labour included, at least until very recently, didn't understand, is that you have to tackle those problems at the root and offer people something more substantial, and not just offer it in a kind of we're selling you a thing way, but actually work out ways, how can we change Britain to give people the opportunity to make decisions about their own lives and their communities and have real control over that and their futures. And that's a huge question for all of us now, not only because we've got economic troubles, but also factors like climate change, the climate crisis, are going to make the material aspects of life, the everyday getting around and getting on in life, much more difficult. And there are a set of very important questions about, well, how do we do this together? How do we get through this together? And if the left is not offering a convincing answer to that, then what we're left with is the far right's false and destructive answers.
Yeah, and whatever we mean by the left, maybe we can define that more broadly as people who care about social justice, people who want to not just look after themselves and their families, which of course is great and essential, and create, a stable and welcoming environment for themselves and their children, particularly people of black and brown people with immigrant histories. It's about social justice and caring and inclusion, and not retreating into our own little bit. And I think it's very important to put it in those human terms. My neighbour passed me today, and he was on crutches, and I wound down the window. I spoke to him, and he said, "Oh, let's have a coffee together. You're on the left, I'm on the right." And I said, "I think we'll find we have lots of things in common, like, let's have decent housing, and let's have decent." He's a disabled man, clearly, and he visits his old mother, who's also very disabled. And I think we have to talk about what we have in common.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that, actually, because I was thinking about it earlier this morning. one of your local MPs in Nottinghamshire, Lee Anderson, who is now a prominent Reform Party MP, if you look at what he did before he went into politics, he
Yes.
worked for the local Citizens Advice Bureau. He worked supporting homeless young people, getting them into housing. Those are acts of care for the community around you. And I can't tell you about his inner world, but I assume he did that because he cared for the community that he lived in. It's just that where I would differ from him is that I think we've got very different ideas about what that community is and should be, who belongs, who doesn't, whose interest things should be running. But it does tell you kind of where, first of all, there's that point of overlap, that point of connection, because, many people, Lee Anderson's been elected several times now for right-wing parties. There are many people who live in his constituency who think, yes, this is somebody who looks out for us. And what you have to start with is the kind of, well, how do we look out for one another? And also, and this is where the response comes in, how do we do it in a way that is actually better and less destructive than what the right are proposing? But if you don't start from that position, you haven't got a chance, I think.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're doing in Nottingham. There was a big solidarity network meeting at the HIMA, which is a local Muslim-led organisation. Lots of black and white and brown people there. And I'm part of a union, the Community Unite, and we go into those areas. And I have met Lee Anderson running a stall. I'm running a stall. We're running a stall, talking about poverty, about your benefits, about housing, the issues. And people come to our stall. They want to know, they want to get help, they want information. And then, of course, we talk to them about, well, who are the real people responsible for the housing crisis, etc., etc. So I think we have to just do more of the things that we already know work. Now, Daniel, what's the hopeful things? Nigel Farage is standing for re-election in Clacton, having resigned and then decided he's going to stand again, costing the taxpayers thousands and thousands. It's all a ruse because we know he's being investigated for having money he shouldn't have through the electoral rules. Two good things. One, Count Binface, which makes everyone smile, is standing against them. Now, Count Binface is an astute political comedian. One of his policies is MPs should be paid the same as the average wages of nurses in the NHS. And there's other funny stuff. The other thing is the 34 candidates, because all the far right candidates, instead of lining up behind Farage and voting Farage, they're all putting their own candidates up. So they're fighting among themselves, people like Rupert Lowe from Restore. So can you give us some grains of hope or pointers to the future of which Clacton wouldn't it be wonderful? Come to Clacton, wouldn't it be wonderful if Nigel Farage lost his seat as an MP to a bin?
Exactly.
Even Binface gets massive votes. It's still humiliating. I think it's a crucial thing, even though it's, a long, long way from Nottingham. I'm going to be there, do my bit. I don't expect black and brown people to be doing that because you're more vulnerable on the streets than me as a white person. Anyway, I'll let you talk about hope and what we need to do just for a few minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I think that the hopeful things, two things you've mentioned already are really important. The fact that, we already know how to challenge this stuff. So, you, as you described, are already doing that in a substantial way. If you're somebody who feels a bit paralyzed watching the news and seeing all of this going on, the good thing is there are lots of things wherever you live that you can get involved in that will not only help challenge the far right in the long term, but can materially improve the conditions of people living around you, and make your community stronger, whether that's kind of helping people organize for rights to work or housing or access to food and so on. And the other thing is, as you just described with this uncalled for by-election and Count Binface, the far right, even now, are very, very vulnerable to pressure, to being challenged. And when they are challenged, don't really know what to do in response, and they start to fall apart. So you've seen, I think, two hopeful signs this year. One is unpleasant in the short term, but if we can keep the challenge going, it will be really helpful to us, which is that the right is splintering. You know, people are getting frustrated with Farage, challenging him. You've got this breakaway from reform called Restore Britain, led by Rupert Lowe and so on. They are making the discourse more extreme, but they're also undermining reform's chances of presenting itself as that moderate party that it needs to come across as to win seriously higher numbers of votes. And also, I think the bin face stuff shows the right way to challenge this, which is to take it seriously. But taking it seriously does not mean being serious about it and believing everything they say, but actually, if you think it's nonsense, call it out as nonsense. If you think it's laughable, laugh at it, mock it. You know, these are all things that are very, very useful ways of communicating what we actually think and we believe. And it is really sending them into a panic at the moment, I think.
Great. Well, we'll have some updates on that, I hope. And we have to stop. And thank you again, Daniel, for your time, especially at short notice and longer than you might have wanted as well, because I know you're very, very busy. And thank you again for your wonderful book. And I will take to heart your ideas and will spread them in this community. And thank you for your particular contribution to this ongoing and vital movement about anti-racism and building a better, more inclusive, fairer society. And we're going to play the song, I think, and say bye for now and listen in next week. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Jeannie. Thanks a lot.
We will stand strong, united, different voices, one heartbeat, walking together through every street, through every storm, through every fire. We rise higher and higher, hand in hand we all belong. Many hearts, but one strong song. Love and unity, that's the power of our community. Side by side for all to see. One world, one humanity. Love, hope, and unity, stronger together eternally. Lift your voice and sing with me. Love, hope, and unity. Every child deserves tomorrow, free from hatred, free from sorrow. Every culture, every name, under the sky we're all the same. So be the light when darkness falls, build bridges stronger than walls. History changes when people rise, with truth and compassion in their eyes. No fear, we choose understanding. No silence, together we're standing. Hope will shine across the night when hearts unite for what is right. Love, hope, and unity, the rhythm of our community. One voice, one destiny. Love, hope, and unity. Love, hope, and unity. I dream for all humanity, together now and endlessly. Love, hope, and unity.